a serious man like Judge Goldstone would put that as the first priority, take the matter to the Security Council or to the United Nations or to the United Nations Human Rights Council. It's an absurd suggestion and a trivializing suggestion. The second suggestion is, he said, end the blockade and the rockets will stop. Nobody ever thought of that before. Israel tried that. First, it didn't have a blockade when the rockets began. That's like people who say end the occupation and terrorists will stop, terrorism will stop. The terrorism started in 1929. The PLO, which started as a terrorist organization, was established before the occupation. And terrorism was rampant in the 50s and the early 60s. And rockets were pervasive before Israel started the blockade. And whenever Israel loosened the blockade, the rockets increased in scope. Yes, there was a ceasefire. It was a ceasefire because Israel had succeeded in killing some of the leading Hamas terrorists, and it was to the advantage of Hamas to have a ceasefire for a period of time so that more of their terrorist leaders would not be subject to targeted assassination. But Hamas ceasefires, hudnas, are self-designed simply to encourage the development of better weapons and more leaders. And that, again, is something, of course, Israel would have done in a minute if they could have. The blockade was designed, by the way, the blockade never caused the humanitarian crisis. It caused a reduction in the number and quantity of certain kinds of goods that would come in. But the humanitarian situation in Gaza, at its worst, was better than it was in comparable adjoining areas of Egypt. The best proof of that is, remember when the people of Gaza, Hamas leaders, broke down the fence and went to Rafah and other parts of Egypt, and they immediately came back. They said, oh my God, in Gaza we have air conditioning, we have gas for our cars, we have clean water. In Egypt they have none of those things. So it was never a humanitarian crisis, but nonetheless, clearly Israel was trying to put pressure on Gaza through the boycott, but it had no relationship to the rockets whatsoever. His third one, and the one he emphasizes over and over again, is Israel should have had commando raids. Now, do you know what it means to have commando raids in the middle of Gaza City? You know, a single Israeli soldier has not been in Gaza City now in years and years, even way before the end of the occupation. Israel did not have soldiers in Gaza City. You cannot send commandos into Gaza City. You can send them into the West Bank, and Israel has had successful commando raids and some unsuccessful ones in the West Bank. And who made Judge Goldstone a general? Who gave him his army commission? Who made him the commander-in-chief? What proper role does he have to tell Israel that it should have preferred commando raids in which 23 of its soldiers were killed to Air Force raids? There's a great debate raging in Israel. Professor Kashir, who's a professor of philosophy, had a debate with Michael Walzer about how you evaluate the lives of your own soldiers versus the lives of civilians or people within the continuum of civilianity on the other side. It's a very hard question. And Israel has resolved it by putting its soldiers at risk generally to save Palestinian lives, even though Palestinian civilian lives aren't always civilian lives. As I mentioned, there is a continuum of civilianality. Obviously, the least civilian are the people who are sending the rockets, but less and less civilian are people who finance, who hide, who facilitate. For example, there are photographs I just saw today. You can see it. It's on a computer that's 5 feet in front of me, of a mosque, one of the mosques in Gaza, and you see the stand on which the imam preaches from, and underneath the stand you see weapons. And then in the basement of the building you see weapons. It's very hard to send in commandos to attack that kind of thing. Precision weaponry, and probably more casualties, would be caused by commando raids than, in fact, Israel did, in the end, do stage 3. Stage 3 of the attack, stage 1 was air cover, stage 2 was breaking Gaza into half and having some very focused attacks on outlying areas. Stage 3 was an attack on Gaza and an attempt to really capture the leaders of Hamas. They didn't do that because a commando raid would be too risky, not only for Israel, but the population itself. Just do an analogy in the Second World War. We used the atomic bomb because analysis showed that if the United States had invaded the home islands of Japan, as many as 4 million Japanese civilians might have been killed and over 100,000 American soldiers killed, and that was a terrible, tragic choice. There are tragic choices in life. When Winston Churchill made a decision not to disclose that Coventry was about to be bombed because that would reveal the existence of the machine that was breaking the German code. These are terrible, terrible, tragic choices. You get no sense of tragic choice from this report. No sense of hard questions from this report. Everything is simple. Everything is easy. There's a line. The line is crossed. A combatant is somebody who wears a uniform. If he's not wearing a uniform, he's not a combatant. Hamas doesn't wear civilian clothes. They generally wear their uniforms. They don't hide among civilians. Simple, simple, simple. But they're not true, not accurate. These are very, very hard questions. And the fourth obvious suggestion is Israel could use targeted killing. But when Israel used targeted killing, the very organizations, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, the Human Rights Council, the United Nations, condemned Israel for that. So Israel has been told essentially, everything you do, we will condemn. You have no option other than to do nothing and allow your civilians to be killed. That is not an option acceptable in any democracy. So they decided not to say what Israel could do. And by the way, in the course of it, they had, Israel made a decision. I disagree with Israel's decision, but it made a decision for understandable reasons, not to cooperate with the investigation. That didn't mean that the Goldstone Commission didn't have access to Israeli material. All you have to do is Google and look at the internet. And Israel provided through NGOs and others a considerable amount of material, and others provided material. I'll give you a striking example. A man who headed the NATO forces in Afghanistan, a man named Colonel Richard Kemp, offered to provide testimony. He ultimately did testify, but his testimony was rejected. He offered testimony that would have been extremely relevant on this issue. He said, I am the former commander of the British forces in Afghanistan. I served with NATO and the United Nations, etc., etc. Went on and on into his resume. Based on my knowledge and experience, I can say this. During Operation Cast Lead, the Israeli Defense Forces did more to safeguard the rights of civilians in a combat zone than any other army in the history of warfare. And then he goes on to describe how Israel had no choice but to do what it did because it was facing an enemy that deliberately positioned its military capabilities behind the human shield of civilian population. What could be more relevant? It goes on and on. Those of you who want to can read his words. They're several pages long. And yet Goldstone issued a statement saying, of course we paid no attention to Colonel Kemp's statements because what he said was not relevant to anything we were doing in our mission. Could you imagine anything more relevant? And this is a commission that found that there were no human shields used, and here was a man who was going to testify that human shields were used and that Israel did more than any other army in the history of warfare, and yet this testimony was rejected. I mean, that tells you a little bit about the mindset of a commission and a man who would not sit here and debate me, because he doesn't want to hear the other side. He doesn't want to listen to evidence or information that will undercut his position. He doesn't want to hear me. He doesn't want to hear Colonel Kemp. He doesn't want to hear those on the internet who would provide videotapes and video recordings and photographs that would undercut his position. Look, once he was appointed to this commission, there are 6 things that could have been done.